And for more on this, let's bring in Robert Baines. He is the president of NATO Association of Canada, joining us from London. Good evening, Robert, and thanks for joining us on CTV News Channel.
Good evening.
So, Robert, NATO is 70 years old and has come a long way in shaping the world as of today. But we are faced with many conflicts, difference of opinions, other emerging powers. How does NATO need to evolve further?
Well, you've already brought in a lot of the different issues that are being dealt with at the moment. The changing world order, what would have been called the rules-based international order or post-World War II world order, is definitely under threat. Growing populism specifically, you can think of Mr. Trump as one of the symptoms of that. It has really changed the working operation of NATO. And if you think of NATO, it is really a group of nations that have said something very simple, which is an attack upon one is an attack upon all. To maintain that kind of cohesion, you need to understand each other, you need to communicate, you need to be able to look each other in the eye and be willing to negotiate for things that you want collectively. That has become more and more difficult over the past few years, and we'll see what happens tomorrow. There's a lot of issues on the table.
Right. Let's talk about Canada's role. Now, current role, we heard the Prime Minister say how we are playing a crucial role when it comes to countries like Iraq, in Latvia, but we haven't really met the numbers of defense spending.
That's correct. The Prime Minister has been quite clear on this. I've actually been really impressed over the past 2 days. His rhetoric has been just bang on. It's something that is not new. Canada has been arguing that it has been pulling its weight and perhaps above its weight as far as what it's been doing with our defense spending. So our capabilities and our contributions to the missions are really quite standalone. They have been tremendous for the size of our military. Because we are in North America and we have to be able to transport our troops, we have to have much more of an expeditionary capacity. It means that we've been doing a lot more as far as NATO missions are concerned. And if I may, there's one extra point. We used to do a lot more UN missions. Most Canadians will think of that as, the peacekeeping tradition. Well, we've been doing a lot more through NATO, and that is keeping peace through strength, which has been very successful.
Okay. Robert, I want to talk to you about United States' role in NATO. I mean, over the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen how many are beginning to say there are doubts on whether or not U.S. will continue to play that stable role when it comes to NATO. What's your assessment?
Well, there's obviously the difficulty of leadership. When you are dealing on an international scale with a multilateral organization, you need to be able to trust what people say. You need to work with your partners and specifically be able to work with the military and the State Department. Everybody who's involved in the State Department and the U.S. Armed Forces are very much invested in NATO and being able to use their multilateral organizations for the use of the United States. It's to their own interest. Donald Trump does not believe this. And the problem there becomes the leaders who are dealing with the United States. The whole bureaucracy of the United States might be behind NATO. The entire Congress is. But just because Donald Trump can, with the wave of his pen and the tapping of his fingers on his cell phone and with a tweet, change U.S. policy so that all of that hard work just goes right out the window. So the trust is very much undermined by everything pretty much that Donald Trump does.
Okay, that's something very important you're saying at the moment, Robert. But let's also speak about how NATO was formed 70 years ago, which is, of course, to counter the superpower then, Soviet Union. 70 years later, we're looking at Russia. We're looking at the rise of economic might, military might of China. What's your understanding? How much of a role will China play in the discussions going?
It has been identified for a few years now that NATO has to do a lot more. As you'll appreciate, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the approach of NATO to Russia was one of even hoping that Russia might join NATO one day. It was really all about trying to make sure that the former Soviet Union might be brought into NATO. That has happened. Obviously, now the sense is that perhaps NATO went too far. I don't personally think that, but there is the argument coming from the Kremlin that NATO has encroached on traditional Russian territories. The key with China, I think, is that NATO is trying to learn from that so that we don't make the same mistakes. We don't poke China in the eye, as it were, by treating them as an adversary or encroaching on what they might see as their space, especially in the Southeast Asia. So I think everybody's being very, very cautious. They don't want to treat China as a threat, more as an obvious global power that has to be dealt with in an appropriate way.
All right. We appreciate these insights. Robert Baines, president of the NATO Association of Canada. Thank you so much for joining us on the channel.
A pleasure.